So today we're going to return to our discussion of modern social theory and sort of what humanists can learn from these speakers. In previous weeks we covered 17th century English thinkers of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Both of them lived during times of big political upheaval in England, and both developed sort of arguments that justified the establishment of sovereign monarchs, just kings and queens who could look over us. Hobbes argued from a materialistic, rational perspective that humans are inherently savage, and to maintain peace and order, we require this sort of sovereign monarch to keep us from killing each other, so we need power to look after us. Locke saw the dangers of authoritarianism and religious violence and instead argued for tolerance and the right to dissent, and he even put the first limits on what government could do. And both started, though, with the individual, sort of the basis unit for society. So you have to look at a person, what human nature is, and then try to derive how society should be organized. But this week and next, we're going to turn our attention to pre-revolutionary France in the 18th century, which was a time of great decadence and enlightenment. I'll first talk about Montesquieu today, who was born as Charles Louis II in 1689. Montesquieu was raised in a wealthy family. He was very privileged and well off. He wasn't the firstborn, though, so he wasn't the most well off, so he did have to work a little bit. He worked as a mercenary briefly in Turkey, and then eventually got a law degree at the University of Bordeaux. But like anyone who's not well off, but in the aristocracy, he just married wealthy, and so he got a large dowry from his wife's family. And soon after that, he inherited his uncle's title as the Baron de Montesquieu and became the, quote, president of the Parliament of Bordeaux. This seemed to be mostly a ceremonial title. It didn't actually mean he was important. It was just what he was. Through his life, he witnessed the birth of the constitutional monarchy in England and the unification with Scotland, which formed the Kingdom of Great Britain. Meanwhile, in France, King Louis XIV's long reign ended in 1715 with his death, and the crown passed to 5-year-old Louis XV, whose reign was marked more by passionate affairs with women like Madame de Pompadour and intellectual pursuits than with actual good governance.
At what age? 6, 7?
I think so, yeah.
He got involved early, didn't he?
In 1748, Montesquieu published his major work, The Spirit of Laws, and passed away in 1755. Unlike the English thinkers, Montesquieu and the French philosophers were methodological collectivists. They started from society and assumed that there was something more than just people. They argued that a collective consciousness and what Montesquieu called the general spirit existed. This isn't a supernatural force, this is just sort of the combined wisdom of all the people. They argued that this couldn't be reduced to individuals, so the sum is greater than the parts, or collective wisdom is an emergent property, if you like that terminology.
What type of collectivist did you say?
Methodological collectivist. So they approach the world by assuming you can have these collective societies. Montesquieu even went as far as to argue that the path of civilization is to progress from individualism to a more collective society. So if you're just purely individualistic, you're very barbaric, but as we civilize, we get into larger and larger societies, and you lose maybe yourself a little bit in that. He was also concerned more with the hows, or the nature and manner of governance, than with the whys, or the raw theory of justification that Hobbes sought. Montesquieu's treatise focused on the practical aspects of government. What kinds of government are there, and how should they be structured? Rather than just arguing from pure reason why we should be governed at all. So what did Montesquieu actually contribute to this social theory? Why are we even talking about it? The Spirit of Law covers several major topics, of which I'll cover 3. The first is the different kinds of government. The second is the argument for the separation of powers. And finally, he touched on how the environment affects society. Montesquieu's 3 main types of governments were republics, monarchies, and despotic states. A republic was the rule of a small aristocracy or a democratically elected government. An aristocracy would see the best people chosen or volunteer themselves for governance, who would be there by choice, whereas in a democracy, people would be selected by lottery, not necessarily by vote, so they'd just be picked at random. He noted that while everyone may be prepared to vote for representatives, not everyone was qualified to be a representative. So in some cases everyone could vote, but some people wouldn't make good politicians. He believed the basic principle of a republic required people to believe their governors to be virtuous. If that virtuosity were broken, corruption would lead to tyranny in a despotic state. In a monarchy, which was Montesquieu's favorite form, or at least a constitutional monarchy, one individual would hold the sovereign power, but would be limited by fundamental laws, so they couldn't do anything they wanted. These laws represented constitutional limits on their power. The principle of monarchist government, then, would be that the sovereign had to be viewed as honorable by their people. Otherwise, it would lead to despotism or a revolt if they didn't have faith that this was a decent human being leading them. Finally, in a despotic state, one person has all the power with no limits on them. Think Germany's Hitler, or Hitler's Germany, or Stalin's Soviet Union. So it's just a authoritarian fascist regime with no limits. These leaders are basically above the law, and their principal power comes from fear. If they keep people afraid, they can keep them in line. So Montesquieu preferred the constitutional monarchy, which seemed, I think, just to be in line with what everyone was thinking and just accepted in that time of thinking, especially among the aristocracy like himself. So if Montesquieu is right about the three different kinds of governments and their relation to human nature, that is the virtuous republic or the honorable monarchy or the fearful despot, then I think the humanist ought to favor the former. The proposition that humans ought to be ruled by fear is counter to our affirmations that each person have the right to strive for their full potential. Meanwhile, the concept of honor is tied up with centuries or millennia of unquestioned traditions. I believe it is better to hope that there is something virtuous in each of us, or some intrinsic capacity for virtue from our representatives, so long as we are provided with a way to rout out corruption when it arises and replace our government through nonviolent means. In the next section of the nature of, or the spirit of laws, Montesquieu argues for the separation of powers, which sort of forms the basis of the American democratic system. But it's also seen to a lesser extent in Westminster-style or British-style parliaments like Canada has. Locke had argued for a similar separation, but Montesquieu really filled in the arguments and underpinned the need for checks and balances on different branches of government. He split the government into the three familiar branches that we know as the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And he argued that no one person should hold power over two of those offices. The legislature would exist to create laws that would sort of guide the government. They wouldn't do the day-to-day actions, but they would sort of give direction. The executive would be empowered to administer and implement those laws, so they don't create the policy, they implement it, they decide how to do it, make the regulations. And the judiciary sort of fills the gaps when there's disputes. So they arbitrate disputes and they interpret the laws. Montesquieu saw no issue with the executive power being held by a monarch or an absolute power, or a monarch. He even argued that it might be better as it would bring stability and continuity to a nation. You know, we don't have to worry about the executive being changed over every few years. He also suggested that by consolidating the executive powers into one or a few people, you'd save some bureaucratic mess and things would be more efficient since one person could do things more efficiently than a committee. He generally supported elected legislatures, though, and started to argue towards a universal vote, at least for those who held property. So he was still an aristocrat in 18th century France, so if you didn't have property, you didn't count. Among all of the other things they would count people for. Montesquieu argued that were one person to hold power over the legislature and the executive, there would be no liberty. His argument for this was that anyone who could pass a tyrannical law could then just execute them right away. So you could decide that half the population needed to go to the gulag, but if you don't have the executive on side with that, you have some liberty. But if they both agree, then you can take people's freedom away. By separating the two functions, people are protected from despotism. Similarly, if the judiciary were not independent then liberty would be arbitrary, as laws could be passed to just persecute citizens. One of Montesquieu's more revolutionary ideas, though, was the need to protect the will of the minority from the will of the majority, or sort of the tyranny of the majority situation. He framed it, though, in a more conservative way as a protection for the aristocrats and the rich from the general population or the poor masses from persecuting them. But they did these arguments did set the groundwork for the universal rights that we have today. To enact this sort of protection for the rich, Montesquieu argued we should split the legislature in two and have an upper house for the rich people and sort of an elected house for everyone else. And that way they can sort of balance each other. We see this sort of in the US with the Senate and the House of Representatives, where the Senate was sort of divided by state, but the House was divided by population. In Canada, we have the Senate that's unelected and the Parliament, or House of Commons, that is. However, despite these noble intentions, we know all too well that the three branches he describes tend to blur, even in the United States. Recent US presidents from both parties have arguably crossed the line from executive into legislative powers by passing executive orders that probably should have gone through the legislature. Meanwhile, in Canada, the executive branch, or the Prime Minister and Cabinet, have long held control over the House of Commons. As party discipline increases and the role of the Governor General is decreased, checks and balances in this country seem to just fade away. And that, again, is not limited to any one party. We've seen that through successive consolidation of power for the years. Montesquieu seemingly foreshadowed that a republic or a democracy was no guarantee of freedom or liberty, or the separation of powers. He argued for a constitutional monarchy because during his lifetime, most European kingdoms were fairly stable and moderate, while the republics of Italy were had all of the power centralized and were always engaged in wars with one another, and there were fewer liberties. Finally, Montesquieu is often credited with inventing political sociology as a field, with the final section of The Spirit of Laws, in which he argues geography and climate influence society and the resulting laws. He notes that different environments affect people differently, so our laws should reflect that. While seemingly obvious, these ideas were actually quite ahead of their time, and it wouldn't be heard again until Emile Durkheim, nearly 100 years later, or over 100 years later. However, many of Montesquieu's notions about climate were somewhat absurd to the modern reader. For example, at one point he argues that colder climates like Europe produce more courageous, confident, and knowledgeable people, as their hearts have to work harder. While those from hotter countries, like say Africa or the Middle East, tend to be more timid as people. But he's not completely racist. He's not as racist as he sounds, because he did argue if you were the child of Europeans born in, say, the Indies, you would lose that European courage.
France had the best climate.
Yeah.
Of course.
So like Hobbes and Locke, it's important to view Montesquieu's ideas within the context and era in which he lived. France was in the era of great wealth and stability after successive long-ruling kings. New ideas were beginning to flourish and would be decades until after Montesquieu's death, before the French Revolution began. Montesquieu was therefore quite comfortable with the monarchist government, provided it allowed for basic liberties and some representation for the people. As well, coming from a wealthy background, he wanted to protect that privilege of being an aristocrat. In terms of lessons that I think humanists can take from someone like Montesquieu and his ideas, we should remember and recognize the need for checks and balances on our different levels of government. We heard last week about the muzzling of scientists and changing budget priorities, many of which are coming through the executive branch with orders in council not being vetted by the legislature or the people. Meanwhile, there's growing discussion about Canada's Senate. Should we reform it, abolish it, or just maintain the status quo? Keeping Montesquieu's theoretical framework in mind, I think, can help inform our views on this subject. Rather than focusing on just the latest scandal or issue with it, we should consider the range of options available to us and try to determine where our values actually lie and what the best way to implement them is. It's also important to note that Montesquieu's arguments for a bicameral or two-house legislature were to protect privilege of the aristocracy from the threat of the masses. In this light, it's hard as a humanist to defend the existence of an unelected chamber. On the other hand, though, there is the idea that the House of Sober Second Thought is a good balance on the partisanship seen in the House of Commons. So we need to approach this without just thinking of Mike Duffy and wondering where he actually lives. Finally, taking a page from the French Enlightenment thinkers, it's also important for humanists to remember the collective side to society. The Amsterdam Declaration of 2002 states that humanism insists that personal liberty must be combined with social responsibility. While the individual is key, there is an inherent recognition that society doesn't exist, or that society does exist above and beyond the sum total of individuals in the world. This isn't to say we should all be Marxist communists or Randian libertarians, but there's a balance to be found between personal freedom on the one hand and collective strength and prosperity on the other. Let's look out for each other, people. As with our previous discussions, I think there are multiple approaches to each of these ideas as a humanist. So far we've seen three fairly well-off men, and unfortunately most of the philosophers of this field are men. Argue more or less in favor of the status quo, though with some minor revisions here or there. Nevertheless, each has attempted to provide a rational underpinning for how we should approach governance. Even Locke, who had a strong Protestant Christian background, presented his arguments with a secular foundation so they could appeal to everyone. As we continue this series, I hope to further make the case that humanist values, reason, compassion, and hope are the common features that build our liberal democracies. Thank you.